So in order to get a better understanding of the history of forensic psychology, first it's important to know what it is. It's had a wide spread of definitions throughout its history. Some modern psychologists would now describe it as being any application of psychological knowledge or methods to a task faced by the legal system. Psychologists that work in this field are known as forensic psychologists, and they try to understand everything that happens after the crime. They're involved in things like assisting the police, working as expert witnesses, doing criminal research, counseling individuals, or evaluating their risk of recidivism. Forensic psychologists cover many areas compared to criminal psychology. In this field specifically, though, it prevents further crimes from happening or other mistakes inside of the legal system. Forensic psychology is important in today's role in the legal system because it involves the psychological assessment for everyone involved. And just like what we're learning in this course, it's important to know the history to prevent any further mistakes happening in like the legal system or any other area in this field. So the far past begins as early as the 18th century for the development of forensic psychology. In 18th century BC, the Code of Hammurabi was established to include a total of 282 rules. These held fines and punishments to meet the requirements of justice. This was one of the earliest and close to completed written legal codes that was declared by Babylonian King Hammurabi. As you can see in these photos, it was done originally on a black stone that was very rare and difficult to carve into. The Code of Hammurabi included many harsh punishments that we can still sometimes hear today, which one popular one would be an eye for an eye. Much of the development, however, didn't happen within this field. It took place in the last 2 centuries, which I'll be going over in the recent past. The recent past between 1879 and 1999 had a few important people that really helped develop forensic psychology. First guy is the founding father of forensic and criminal psychology. He had coincidentally been a research assistant in one's lab, and then they started to clash on their ideas, so he moved abroad. He moved to the US and became the president of Harvard's psychological laboratory, and in 1908, Munsterberg had started to believe that psychology had developed enough experimental findings where it could advance the cause of law and determine the truth and settle disputes. During this time, however, psychiatric testimony was acceptable by courts, and things in science such as experimental work and other psychological functions weren't being as recognized. The young sciences of psychiatry didn't offer much beyond the classification of insanity, which witnesses pretty much were in favor for on a variety of civil and criminal matters. During this time, from 1905 to 1907, psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung had created a word association test that could help tell whether or not someone had committed a crime. Whether using these machines could detect lying also became a controversial topic among psychologists. Freud had a caution that the utility of these kinds of tests shouldn't be available in legal proceedings because although someone may be innocent, they may react to these measurements as if they were guilty. Munsterberg, the father of forensic psychology, had argued otherwise, that a false confession was possible from implanted memory. This whole situation during this time was a huge stepping stone for the polygraph test that was later developed by William Marston in 1917, where he found that blood pressure had also a strong correlation to lying and then developed the polygraph test. It wasn't until after World War II that forensic psychology had I'd say, larger growth into developing what it is now. The development of training in forensic psychology was a big thing. By the 1960s, there had been a growing number of psychologists in the court. Norman Pothius had been one of the first to write in an article that special training in clinical aspects of forensic psychology would be needed. 4 things he thought that needed to be included were legal tests and concepts, assessments, relevant literature, and courtroom orientation. His ideas heavily influence the type of training that is required in the role to be a forensic psychologist today. An American psychologist by the name of Tom Grosso had focused on the forensic psychological assessments within the clinical forensic domain and had 3 priorities for forensic psychology, mainly talking about new guidelines, incentives for research on forensic assessments, and education on the legal consumer. So that can be expert witnesses, any kind of forensic psychology labeled people. Although the progress of the goals up until 2009 have been very mixed, there has been a large increase on journals and books related to these topics, which later we'll see develop guidelines for forensic related practices. These last 2 stages, I'd say, really set the stage for the rest of the field, leading to the research and discoveries that we now use today in court, make it a little easier and more understandable within the expert witnesses and forensic psychologists within the court. So up until the recent past, most forensic psychologists were operating on their own concepts of what they thought was appropriate, with hardly any guidance and with little sense of identity within this field, up until 2001. That's when the APA recognized forensic psychology as a specialization. Then in 2002, Grosso's forensic psychological assessments had called for 5 other priorities within this field that also needed to be focused on, such as development as practice standards, treatment focus, and more intense training. This field had grown from a small growing specialization to a more founded field. Also, during this time, in the last 7 years, there had been a growth in training on education and training opportunities provided for forensic psychology. There are now numerous doctoral level training programs and law psychology programs within the United States and all over that we didn't see in the recent past. Development within courts is also a big thing during this time. With all of these discoveries and studies taking place around forensic psychology, 2 particular areas have shown growth in the past decade. Drug courts, mental courts, other specialty courts have now gained popularity as well, and we see a lot in forensic and criminal psychology now being taken place. Now, with all the research and discoveries we found within forensic psychology, what it means for the future, probably more consistent training elements. Although there is now development within education for forensic psychology, there are still a lot of opportunities and very little consistency with the core elements in these forensic psychology programs. This will be changing and has been changing for doctoral level classes, and APA has been accredited for a lot of these steps that are now being taken place for the basics of training in forensic psychology. There's still strengths and things that we still need to overcome, as we can tell. It's still a relatively new area, and it still needs to be worked on, particularly in the United States. There are committees and other ways and people that are helping advocate the priorities of forensic psychology within the next decade. Kind of just summarizing it all personally, forensic psychology has continued to expand and evolve over these last centuries, and at one point it had never been seen in court, but now has expanded into several different areas inside the criminal justice system. As research continues to discover, the application of psychology within the legal system is going to continue to grow. The APA, I think, is the first step into recognizing the specialization and taking it in the right direction so it's consistent and how it needs to be worked on. We have more of a conceptualized model of forensic process and everything within the legal system when it comes to being applied to psychology, but I think training and just better tools in general for forensic psychologists. Once they are trained, it's kind of like, how are they able to apply this to their field and have useful resources that are consistent, not just with one person, but with everyone.